For me, it was just as good as it was yesterday. So the lunches, the team has done a wonderful job. So now I'm going to ask Tommy Mitchell Sr. to please come forward so he can introduce our speaker for the luncheon today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today because he's from my second home. And sometimes I suppose don't get mad with you, but I still love New York. He's from New York City. He attended Indiana University. Dr. Lawrence Parker is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Utah. He has developed and taught classes on critical race theory and education policy issues, and has concentrated his research and teaching in this area as it relates to equity in education, both K through 12 and higher education. His most recent publication is a co-authored book chapter that appears in Facing Accountability in Education, Democracy and Equity at Risk. And he recently edited volumes 29 and 31 of the Review of Research in Education for the American Education Research Association. Dr. Parker is associated with the Utah Education Policy Center. Asking him what his passion was, he said his passion is to make sure that elementary, middle, and high school students develop better than he did. And so I think that's an admirable attitude to have, and certainly I'm sure that's why he has developed to the kind of person he has. So without further delay, Dr. Lawrence Parker.
Thank you for that great introduction, and I want to thank the conference organizers, Dr. Webster, and all the other people who were responsible for inviting me here. I feel humbled to be in this audience and to speak to such a passionate group of people here who are concerned about the education of poor youth, African American youth in this country, because we're at a crossroads now that really needs to take place on addressing this issue. And I just wanted to give a couple of shout-outs to the featured speaker for tonight. Her name is Gloria Lassen-Billings. I hope that some of you can get a chance to come for the evening event. She's also a dynamic speaker and a good friend of mine. Her granddaughter plays basketball at UCLA, and so she always texts me and sends me a Twitter when UCLA is coming to play Utah. Says, yeah, check out my granddaughter. She's got some good hops. She got good hops. But she's also a fantastic and prolific scholar. And as a precursor to the talk that I'm going to give right now on critical race theory, I would strongly urge you to take a look at some volumes that she's written and some articles that she's written. And don't mind me, sometimes I just have these citations that zip off the top of my head, but you can tell that all of my citations are our last kid, which is 2003. So bear with me. But anyway, she does really good work on critical race theory, and I would urge you to take a look at some of her work and the work of William Tate. She wrote a piece in Teachers College Record in 1995 on critical race theory. That's a really important piece that sort of set the benchmark for what I'm going to talk to you about in this PowerPoint. And she also wrote a piece in volume 11, number 1 of the 1998 issue of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education on critical race theory. And what she did was she applied CRT to parts of education that address school finance, curriculum, teaching and instruction, and everything else that I'm going to be talking about today. So I just wanted to give some pointers and tidbits in terms of what she's going to be probably talking about today, and also her concern about justice, because we're all concerned about justice, and I'm sure that she'll speak to that. What I'm going to speak to now is giving you a primer on what critical race theory is. But before that, I want to dedicate this talk to my father. And my father was a man who had some influence in my life, and then also disappeared from my life at many points in time. And so I was basically raised by my mom, But my dad still had some important legacies and lessons to impart on me. And one of the things that he imparted on me that I'll never forget is, and I can capture it in this instance. I used to be an avid marathon runner. Ran about 10 marathons before my knee gave out on me. I'm going to have knee replacement surgery in July, so I'm not looking forward to that. But I went to New York City to run the New York City Marathon one year, and I knew that my dad, who lived in the Bronx at the time, could come down and meet me. So we were standing online to get the vouchers to get into the race on the post office downtown, right here in Madison Square Garden, and I was in line and I said, Dad, here's this form. I'm trying to call Mom. Can you read this and let me know what I need to get together in terms of getting up in the front of the line? And it was then that my suspicions about his illiteracy were confirmed, because he couldn't read it. And so I just said, okay, Dad, just give me back the form and I'll take care of it. And then that night, I went ahead and contacted the Adult Literacy Center that I used to do some volunteer work at, and I said, I want to get my dad set up so that he can learn how to read. And so I met him the next week and said, Dad, look, I know what the deal is if you just come with me and come downtown and we're going to go to this center. And I knew all the people there, and I was able to hook him up in terms of being able to read. And before he passed away, I knew that he had finally engaged in being literate. And that is what is important for me. And so I just want to dedicate the talk to him and get started. What I'm going to do is talk about critical race theory, and normally I feel kind of hemmed in, but usually I like to walk around and sort of get into it. But I'll just stand here and be stationary for a little bit. Critical race theory is really a way in which we can theorize about all of the issues, policies, problems that we've been talking about over these last couple of days. I came to it through reading Gloria's work and through reading some of the early CRT scholars, and it's a deep, massive amount of work, but I'm going to give you a quick primer on it so that it can give you a theoretical framework in which to talk about race and racism. And the reason why it's important is because for a long time in education and other fields, racism and race particularly racism, was seen as something that will pass. It was seen as something that was a phenomena that could not be theorized, because racism, as the way in which the liberal paradigm talks about it, is something that will eventually go away, and we will no longer think about race in a post-racial society. The critical race theorist people have said that no, we need to theorize about race. Just like we theorize about quantum physics, just like we theorize about science and about business philosophies, we should theorize about race too, and elevate it to that level, and center it in terms of how we look at policies, practices, ideas, mindsets, emotions that all govern the ways in which kids go to school, particularly black kids, and the ways in which they matriculate, if they can, through college and through graduate school. And then how they live their lives in terms of having a working identity that is connected to race and how they're perceived. So this notion of critical race theory is an important one for us to deal with. And I'm going to, instead of just talking through each point, I'm just going to give some examples of some of the work that is important in terms of trying to understand it and run through a genealogy on what critical race theory is. Critical race theory came out of the legal arena, and it came out of two conferences that took place in around the late 1980s. One was at Harvard Law School, the other one was at Berkeley, and it was formed out of a group up in Madison, Wisconsin. And the names are pretty familiar, and are people who have been at the forefront of CRT, like Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mary Matsuda, and a bunch of other people who were there. And what they talked about was how it was that at the time, you had a lot of legal scholars who were saying that the law is really not this perfect system that engages in adjudication and particular constitutional ways of analysis that will lead to the ways in which we can objectively look at the law and how it's going to lead to particular forms of case law that is founded by administrative precedent. What these scholars were saying is, no, the law is biased, and we know that the law is biased. We know the law is biased in terms of who is able to get wealthy and rich from the law. We know who the law serves in terms of power relationships and other factors that lead to social inequities that are legally sanctioned. What the critical race theorists people talked about was how it was that race needed to be placed at the center of how we look at how the law is operating. And one of the things that they talked about a number of these points in terms of formal equality does not ensure racial equality. They also talked about issues related to how it is that there's this notion of whiteness as property. And what they meant by that, and there's a really good article by Cheryl Harris that she wrote in the 1993 Harvard Law Review in June, was how it was that there was property that was considered in landmass that Native Americans were on. Property was brought from Africa to North America in terms of black slaves, and how that type of notion of whiteness as property was ingrained in the ways in which the laws operated in this country. And that we needed to take a look at that squarely in terms of its present day effects, particularly in terms of how the Native Americans got their land taken from them and how legal racial sanctions were put forth through slavery and Jim Crow and post-Jim Crow era. So there's all these ways in which the critical race theorists wanted to place race and racism at the center of legal analysis. And those are really, and these are some of the important points that they talked about in terms of looking at the key parts of CRT and how it's come about. There's an interesting person who I want to also pay a lot of attention to here in this talk too, named Derek Bell. Derek Bell was probably one of the founding fathers of critical race theory. And if any of you get a chance to get on YouTube and watch a film called The Space Traders, maybe even some of you have seen it. It's a very interesting film, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, because I use it in some of the classes, both at the high school level and at the college level and the graduate school level, in terms of talking about what would happen if aliens came down and decided that they were going to make an offer to the United States, that they would take away all the black people in exchange for trying to solve all the country's problems. Yeah, we got some candidates who are ready to do that. But one of the things that Bale talks about is this notion of space traders that I'll talk about later in the talk. But he also talks about the notion of racial realism, and he also talks about the ways in which interest convergence works. And one of the points that he raised on interest convergence was this. He basically said that white European Americans and the white political power structure will not do anything in this country to benefit African Americans unless they can get a better benefit. And what he meant by that was this. And I'll give an example of what Bell was talking about. Bell pulled some of the historical literature and looked at the ways in which interest convergence worked after World War II. Black troops came back from World War II, and they were subject to discrimination. They were subject to not being able to take advantage of the GI Bill. And by the way, there's a really good book by a guy named Dalton Conley called Being Black and Living in the Red. It's a great book they wrote in 1998, and he definitively describes that if it wasn't for discrimination, and if black troops had been able to take advantage of the GI Bill, we would have a different connection between wealth and race now in terms of how black people are going to be able to move into the middle class. What Bell talks about, though, is that how it is that when black troops came back from World War II, they were subject to the same type of discrimination in terms of not being able to take advantage of the GI Bill, in terms of facing racism, in terms of facing the continued reminiscences of Jim Crow, in terms of the lynchings, in terms of what was going on in the Civil Rights Movement. And as a result, the Europeans started to criticize the United States by saying, wait a minute, You sent these black people, black troops over to fight against Hitler and to do the fight against the Japanese. And yet they come back and you're talking about democracy, and yet they're facing these hypocritical ways in which they're being treated at home. And so as the United States started to get called out on this at the world stage in terms of what they weren't doing for the black troops, it created this way in which historians like to look at the Brown decision in 1954 to basically say that it was an interest convergence decision. That, yes, there are good aspects that came out of Brown in terms of going away, in terms of trying to nip back the aspects of segregation. But let's be real. There are ways in which this serves as an interest convergence for the United States in that they could finally look good on the world stage. And they could finally say, see, we are making progress in terms of treating our black people well. Fast forward to 2008 when Barack Obama got elected. What was one of the first things people started to talk about? This is a great election. Now we can prove that we are a democracy that has come of age. We are a post-racial society. I never forget William Bennett's talking about that right after the election results were over and saying this is going to really not going to work out in terms of what he's talking about. And it has not worked out. But that's one of the key points that Bell talks about in terms of this notion of interest convergence. Also a key point is counter-storytelling and counter-narratives. We all have particular stories about how race and racism work. And those stories can be codified in terms of what the majoritarian story says about how race works and what the counter story says about how race works. And there's a really good piece by a guy named Kevin Brown that he wrote in the Iowa Law Review in May of '94 that talked about race and counter story. And the gist of the article is this. As you're driving down the interstate and you get pulled over by the police. Pull over. Let me see your license. Oh, I found something in the car. Step out. And there's nothing there, but then you get the handcuffs put on you. You get taken to jail. You have to go in front of the judge. And who is the judge going to believe? What story? Your story or the police's story? It's that aspect of what Brown was talking about in that article that laid out the foundation of story, of majoritarian story versus counter story. And that 9 times out of 10, what happens in terms of what critical race theory talked about is the ways in which the counter story gets disbelieved. Now, that has always been a key point of what CRT talks about, because as I go through the talk, what's been important for my research is getting the counter stories of students. Because the students are telling counter stories about what happens to them around discipline procedures, what happens to them around not being able to get into AP courses. The parents tell us counter stories about what happens when they go in and have tense negotiations with school board people and principals around what the status of their kids. There are all types of counter stories that also form in legal terms data that can be used later in terms of legal disputes. So the notion of counter stories is really important in here in terms of talking about what a key part of critical race theory. Critical race theory also can be covered in terms of looking at these next 2 slides. And there are key points around racial microaggressions, and I need to give a shout out to my colleague William Smith, who does work on racial psychology and sociology and does a lot of study on this, looking at racial microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. One of the things he talks about here is how it is that he says the impact of racism and what it does in terms of stresses as a health problem, in terms of the stress that's created, in terms of the ways in which people can't sleep, the eating habits that get disrupted, also in terms of how it is that environmental racism, in terms of taking a look at where kids are going to school in poor neighborhoods, are connected to air pollution or other aspects of environmental hazards that have a deleterious effect on their learning. And so all these aspects are part of what William Smith talks about in terms of racial microaggressions, and then just the racial battle fatigue around what it means to be a person of color, particularly a black person, working in white institutions. And I'll talk about that later in terms of what it means in terms of a working identity and how one has to negotiate that from grade school to high school to college and then onto the workplace. So there's some interesting parts that we talk about that. Also in terms of the subtle and nonverbal insults. There was a research study that we did in Illinois because people were concerned about, well, what's going on here in terms of why African Americans are complaining about how they can't get their financial aid that they deserve in terms of being merit scholars or having particular merit opportunities that have been given to them by the state. So we did a study on that, and one of the things that we found in terms of looking at CRT and microaggressions, and also looking at critical race theory that's connected to the social sciences, is that the blocking point came for those students when they went to the financial aid officer and said, here's my letter, I've gotten this scholarship from the state, I've gotten this particular financial aid package, I would like to fill out the forms and get this processed. And yet, they had all kinds of roadblocks and problems that they had to deal with from the financial aid officers. And the reason why was because we traced it off to racism. Most of the people who were involved in this were from the small town in Champaign-Urbana, and it was most of them predominantly white. The kids who were coming in with all those offers were mostly black and Latino from Chicago. And so the conflict started to happen right then and there in terms of the racial roadblocks that those kids faced, in terms of getting financial aid that they were actually deserved. And so there's ways in which the CRT theories connect with the social science research that we've been doing that take a look at how it is that this types of ethics and mentality get connected to policies that then serve as blockers around racial equity for students who actually deserve it in terms of getting those ACT scores that get them into Illinois and other places of higher education. One of the other things that we talk about in CRT and is connected to social science research is that the elimination of intentional racism does not lead to the elimination of racial inequality, in that a school can say that they are indeed race-free or race-neutral or engage in colorblind ways in which they're going to assign kids to particular classes. But one of the things that we're taking a look at now in terms of the research that we're doing is taking a look at how it is that you have to take a look at race and racism as it functions over time, let's say in a chemistry class, in terms of who gets called on, who doesn't get called on, if there is even a chemistry class in some of the high schools, and how that happens. And so there are ways in which the structural aspects of what goes on in schools really plays a big role in terms of how it is that we shape and look at the connection between critical race theory and social science. CRT in education. I'll bring it down to this point now. When critical race theory came about, it came about out of those scholars that I talked about. And those scholars were being influenced by the Black Power movement, by the Chicano Studies movement back in the 60s and the 70s. They didn't just form critical race theory out of a vacuum. They were being influenced by what was going on in many cities and urban areas and college campuses in terms of the ways in which the movements for change, for racial change, were moving fast and quickly during the 60s, and the ideas that came out of that era. And so, as they started to soak that all up and get that in, and then say, we need to change the ways in which we think about the law and how that operates in this paradigm too, they started to move into taking a look at how it is that education played a role in how we think about and theorize around race. And so some of the education people, and you'll meet Gloria Lasson-Billings today, started to take a look at how it is that we can apply CRT to the education framework. And some of the ways in which they talked about it are some of what I talked about here, in terms of the discipline policies, in terms of equity audits. And I'll say a few brief things about those parts right now. One of the things that we did in Urbana because before I came to Utah, and I'll talk about being one of the 1.3% in Utah at the end. and also to make a statement just off the cuff right now, is that we want to try to do, I think that there needs to be a nationwide summit like this, where we pull together what you all are doing here in Florida, what we want to do in Salt Lake, even with our 1.3%, because we've got problems with that group too, in terms of what's going on with there. And I'll talk about that in terms of how it's conflated with the whole LDS Mormon views about race. And New York City, California, you name it. I think there needs to be a national summit like this, and we need to pull together, and I will do what I can until we get the folks from Utah together so that we can join up with you, okay? In relation to some of the points that I'm going to talk about now, before I came to Utah, my wife and I were professors at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And we were there for 13 years. And as a side note, every time we wake up, she's from Detroit, I'm from New York, and we're like, what are we doing in Salt Lake? How did we end up here? but Champaign, but Champaign also has its problems too. And Champaign Urbana has its problems too. In fact, when we were going to move to Salt Lake, my mom was like, "Oh, don't bring your kids out there. It's going to be bad. It's going to be bad." I said, "Mom, the stats are the same. The stats are the same in terms of black student failure. They're virtually the same. So, I mean, this is going to be the same fight that we had in the Urbana schools. I'm going to be doing the same thing in Salt Lake schools. So, I just got to get ready and be ready for it." But that's another point, and I'll get to that later on in my talk as I wrap it up. In terms of equity audits and follow-ups, there's some interesting research that we've been trying to do, and it's also personal too. For the time we were in Champaign, which is about 13 years, I was involved with a group of graduate students and also personally trying to work with the Urbana schools in Unit 116 around trying to engage in what to do once the equity audit was started. And the equity audits, for those of you, I'm sure you probably know what they are, they're policies that have been developed usually out of some type of court order or court settlement that take a look at every aspect of what your school is doing or not doing in terms of placement of kids in AP classes, in gifted classes, special ed placements, the curriculum that you have, everything. And so they usually hire some type of a set of experts to go in and do the audit for about a week and check out all your records and see what's going on, and then come up with a big report. We were part of trying to do the post follow-up to that report. And it was a labor of activism, a labor of calling out school officials, and really just butting heads against an entrenched ideology of racism that was going on there in terms of what progress was not happening with those kids around even basic things like dress codes and how high your skirt had to be in terms of being able to walk into Urbana High School on a spring day, and then who suffered from that in terms of school suspensions. It was black girls as opposed to white girls. And those types of basic things. We went ahead and tried to fight those fights for a long, long time and had many meetings with school board leaders. In fact, there was one time we had a tape of all the people who were involved in the original equity audits back in the 1960s and got them all together before some of them passed away, and got their impressions of what it was like back then and what it was like now. And it was very eye-opening. But anyway, when I left in 2010, it was an interest convergence in terms of finally the students were the ones at Urbana High School, and you can take a look at what's going on there, who were the ones who were able to put together a coalition group to say, you know, we don't like this dress code, because we're seeing this, we're taking tabs on this, and we're seeing that it's affecting African American girls more than white girls. You know, we don't like what's going on in terms of the lack of AP classes, and we don't like what's going on in terms of what's happening with the special ed placement of kids who have needs as opposed to being dumped out in a special ed classroom that isn't going to be effective. And what happened was, as the students started to push for this, the district also started to change. And it was interesting when I got an email one time from one of my former students that said, "Larry, you won't believe this. The school board lost, new superintendent, new principal at Urbana High School, and it's a new day." And sure enough, it was this whole big turnaround because the pressure the students put on the schools to make fundamental change around race. And I think that one of the things that we need to take out of this conference is that there is hope in terms of having trust in students to do the right thing and push for their own change, and to help them to do that in terms of helping them empower themselves. Because as adults, we were trying to make those changes for years and years, and it didn't work really, and it just was like butting heads. But it was that interest convergence that happened in terms of a new leadership that was able to listen to students and take them seriously, that then led to things like Urbana High School engaging in a total detracking of their math and science curriculum. Because the teachers decided, we want to make sure that our kids, every kid, particularly African American kids in Urbana, are able to leave this high school and learn how to do math and how to do science. And so we know tracking is going to contribute to that. The research says that. Everybody knows that. And so we're going to do our best to try to detract math and science in the high school. And they did. Now, English was another story. But it just showed the purpose of how it was that those students were able to make that happen. And so those are some of the ways in which the structural aspects of racism and whiteness connected with social class and the discipline policies of special ed are coming to fruition around some of the research and active work that I've been doing around CRT and connecting it to education. In terms of race, in this term called neoliberalism, which is another form of colonialism that some of my academic colleagues like to use fancy words, it's just another form of colonialism and another form of racism. But I think these points are important in terms of looking at some of the key aspects that are important here, like racial capitalism and working identity. And one of the things I like to talk about here is when you drive down some universities or some high schools, you'll see these big signs of, and this was really ironic in Utah. Utah's got a 1.3% black population. Yet, when you drive around the campus, there are signs of black people going, the U, and I'm black and I love being at the University of Utah, or I'm part of the Ute Nation, and I'm part of the University of Utah. And so, one time I was teaching my class, and I said, look, we're going to just stop the lesson. And we're going to get in our cars and we're going to drive around campus. I want you to count all these signs here of all these black people. And then I want you to find out how many of those kids are going to the University of Utah. What's the percentage of the kids who go to the University of Utah from the local high schools around here? How many black kids are here? And get the development office to tell you that. And so that I just suspended the class and everybody, that was the next assignment. And what we found was that some of those kids were there, then they dropped out. They really weren't reflective of the percentages of the folks on the campus. And so I linked it to racial capitalism, because the university was getting a capital mileage out of putting those kids on those billboards. Because they could show that they were diverse. And they could show that it was hip to go to the University of Utah if you were Native American, even though the scholarship money wasn't there. And those are just ways in which the racial capitalism played out around how it was that we were taken advantage of in terms of the color of our skin, but yet the inequities were still part and parcel of what was going on, which led them to a November 20th meeting that happened last fall with the African American students and and another student group of coalition with the university to say, don't put us on the posters anymore, because it's not reflective of what's going on. So don't even do it. Just stop doing that stuff, so that we can just really get to the point of what it means to be a person of color at a predominantly white university. The working identity is something that I also talk to my students too about, what it means to be to have that type of mindset at a place like Utah. And what it means is that there are ways in which working identity works through, as this freshman class that I'm teaching now, they say it's like being on stage, Dr. Parker. I'm always sort of being looked at in terms of being who I am and what that means like, and how I'm going to be able to be the one black or the one Latino or the one American Indian in the class. And I got to talk about racism or I got to talk about what happened at the theme party on Saturday night, and what do you think about all that stuff? It puts those kids on the spot, and it really creates this ways in which they're always on stage. And I say, you know something, that's going to be part of working at the world of work. If you get that job, if you luckily get that job at Goldman Sachs, it's going to be even worse. And so you're going to have to start to deal with that, negotiate with that, but also challenge it too. And so there's ways in which the whole work around working identity is important. I also think that this part is anchoring race theory in Latin America is also important too, because this is something that came out of a colleague of mine who I work with sometimes named Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And he wrote a book about having race without racism. And what he talks about, he's a sociologist at Duke. And this came up in a casual conversation that I had with him. And he said, because I told him I was going down to Chile. I went down to Chile with my wife on the pillow and our 12-year-old son, Lorenzo. And he said, Parker, watch out about race down in South America and check it out down there. So I said, okay, I'll go down there, just check out Chile, being in South America. And it was interesting in terms of how it was that I got mistaken for a black Argentinian. I mean, I don't know what that meant about being black and being Argentinian. I mean, I could see Brazilian or Colombian, but an Argentinian? I got stopped twice on the street. You from Argentina? And I was like, what's going on with there? And he said, it's because that we need to start looking at how race and racism got formed in the Caribbean and South America first, before we go to start taking a look at Europe. Because the European situation with North America is something that we're familiar with, but it actually really started when the Spanish and the Portuguese started those racial categories, when they started the slave trade, and when they started to wipe out the Indians. Because later on, as I gave that talk down in Santiago, and I gave a CRT talk, and I think the director of the conference put me on first for a reason. I think I know why. The first hand that came up was like, well, we don't have a race problem in Chile because we got rid of all the Indians. And she was serious. We got rid of all the Indians. So we don't have a race problem. so I said, oh, okay. Well, we got some work. We got a little talk. But what they're facing now is that there's this way in which they've got to deal with it now because of the ways in which Colombians and Venezuelans are moving back in there. And they still have a small native population of the Machipe down there that they also have to deal with. And so there's ways in which we also have to take a look at how racism and neoliberalism are playing out in Latin America, because what's going to happen in some continents is eventually going to flip up here. So we've got to be ready to try to address this, and I think that CRT is a way in which we can go on looking at this. The future areas of research for critical race theory. Thinking about racism and race as a verb instead of a noun. I think that this is a really important point for me to try to stress real quickly. One of the things in which we can conceptualize this, and I'll give an example here, is I've been doing some work at one of the middle schools in Salt Lake, and the long and the short of the work that I've been doing with the school and the administrative team is this. The school has been considered one of these high poverty schools with mostly black and Latino students on the west side of the city and with low failure rates, et cetera, et cetera. And the administrative team was trying to look at ways in which they could really hear from what the parents had to say vis-a-vis the teachers. So I said, okay, why don't you set this up so that you get the teacher's attitudes about the kids. What do you think about these kids in terms of trying to educate them? Are they educable? Do you love them? Do you care about them? And the teachers all said, oh yes, we love these kids. We think that they can do well, and they're excellent kids. And just because they don't do well on the test doesn't mean that they can't learn it. And sort of all the good teacher accolades. We then went to the parents and sent a survey for the parents and said, okay, what do you want out of the school? What do you want your kids to be 5-10 years from now in terms of being good people, good citizens, being able to learn, being able to do well in life? And the parents laid out all these ways in which they felt that in terms of what they wanted for their school and what they wanted their kids to learn. And so what we did was we got all those groups together and said, okay, now this group the teachers are saying one thing. The parents have these different expectations. How are we going to make this work? because the teachers' expectations, while they said they believed in those kids, we showed them the data and they said, well, if you believe in those kids, why is this data showing up so that there's continual failure rate among your African kids, your African American kids, and your Latino kids? And also, if the parents are saying they want you to do this, why isn't this happening? It led to some hard conversations that we had to have, and we're still having with that middle school around expectations, around belief systems, around the ways in which those kids are being tracked, and the ways in which those kids are being treated, and the mindsets of the teachers there. That is difficult to try to change, but we've got to start moving in that direction of seeing racism as a verb. Because as you start to go into the classrooms, over time, you're going to see racism not act as a noun, but as a verb in terms of the inactions that happen or actions that happen. So, for example, you take a look at a math class or a science class, and there are ways in which you can record teachers acting in certain ways in terms of who they call on, in terms of where kids sit, in terms of the challenging assignments that some kids will get over others, and also in ways in which they will purposely set up some African American kids to do well. But if they don't perform well in that way, it confirms to the teacher's bias. Say, see, I knew that kid couldn't do well, so I'm going to make sure that these other kids who happen to be Asian American or white can do better, and I know that they can always do better in math anyway, as opposed to black kids. And so there's ways in which this comes about, and there's a good article on this by McKeith in the Harvard Ed Review in 2014 that points out this ways in which she talks about the kinesiology of race and how racism should be seen as a verb when you start to take a look at teacher actions. When you take a look at the leadership policy actions, that's also important too. Particularly when we take a look at what I just talked about at Glendale Middle School. What I'm going to end up with talking about now is to give you a sense of what Salt Lake City is like and the type of critical race theory work that it takes to try to be the 1.3% out there. And it's based on some of the points that Derek Bell talked about in Space Traders. For people who don't know, what Space Traders was about this ways in which in Derek Bell's counter story, aliens come to Earth to offer to solve all the crime problems facing the U.S. in terms of environmental contamination, reliance on fossil fuels, national debt, etc., if the U.S. agrees to give the aliens all their persons classified as black. The main character in Space Traders is Professor Goldlightly. He is an African-American moderate Republican who is a member of the President's cabinet. He, among others, voices strong objections to the offers made by the aliens and works with a group of wealthy white capitalists and business leaders to initially lead a campaign against the offer. He does this because he feels whites will be capitalists first and racists second, and that the financial impact of blacks being sent to space will hurt the economic viability of the U.S. economy. But later in the story, Professor Goldlightly posits that the position of interest convergence is the best way to get whites to vote with blacks against the offer. He perceives that it's the interest convergence will be most in the best interest of blacks in the U.S. because they will engage in a campaign of saying that the space trader deal is a form of reverse discrimination, and that these space traders will treat blacks so well in terms of equality, civil rights, economic, political opportunities, that whites will be jealous and want to stop the vote and want to stop and vote against the offer. In the end, however, the vote to accept the deal overwhelmingly passes, and the blacks are boarded on the bus to the oceanfront areas and beamed up through alien spacecrafts into the sky. When I use space traders in high schools, as I said before, the high school students have very different ideas than college students and then from graduate students. When I've gone to teach, to work with high school students on this, particularly high school classes in history or African American studies, and it's predominantly black, they'll all say, oh yeah, this could easily happen. No question about it. They'll come and take us in a minute. They want us out now, in fact. The undergraduates, in some extent, and definitely the older professional masters and doctoral students have a different and more mixed view. Some say that the U.S. having had his first black president, and overall overt individual racist acts in the U.S. being on the decline, and therefore the majority of the population, particularly white Europeans and Americans, would vote against the space trader offer. In the classes reading the counter stories, it's come to me that I wanted to have my students do some counter stories to this as well. And one of the students wrote a counter story to this in connection to a book that Gloria actually is going to be producing later. And I'll read the counter story real quickly. It's called Space Traders Come to Take a Problem Off the School's Hands for one of my students. And it goes as follows. Mr. Johnson hung up the phone and laid his head on the desk. It was after 6 p.m. and he was still in his office. To say it had been a long day would be an understatement. It began as it has in terms of the news crews lining up in Park Hill School to look at a particular racial incident where a group of students went across the basketball court in KKK outfits for their school spirit pride parade. But then it was pointed out to Mr. Johnson that somebody came up to him and talked about this ways in which aliens were going to come in. And just then, a bright light came and a loud beeping noise interrupted the silence that Mr. Johnson was in. He looked up just in time to see a video seemingly projected in midair above his desk. On the screen, a white middle-aged man appeared and said, Mr. Johnson, I represent a consortium of powerful space-age individuals who are interested in helping you out. We can solve all your school's problems and raise student test scores and ensure that the school board views you and your school positively. As an added bonus, we can guarantee you the state football championship, as well as scholarships to top-tier schools for all your graduates. All we ask in return is that you give us all your African-American students. Mr. Johnson was stunned. What do you mean all the African-American students? He asked. We simply ask for access to every African-American enrolled in your school. They'll be removed, and you no longer will have them as your concern. In return, you and your all-white teaching staff will be working with students, and they will benefit from everything we have to offer to you. It will result in high test scores, positive reputation, support, and praise from the school board, and a football championship, and scholarships for all your graduates. What's going to happen to the African-American students? Mr. Johnson asked. The man in the video simply replied, don't worry about that. This is our offer. You have 24 hours to accept it. The next morning, Mr. Johnson called an emergency meeting with his two assistant principals. As they were sitting down in the conference room, Mrs. Boston, who was part of the school board, and the district superintendent walked in and insisting to be heard. As it turned out, everyone in the room received the same message and were eager to discuss the options. This could be a great benefit to the school and the remaining students, Superintendent Calhoun began. We wouldn't have a problem with racism if we didn't have those black students, and the school could simply use higher test scores. Not to mention how happy the parents would be with the scholarships to get to college. The two white male assistant principals nodded in agreement. Mr. Johnson looked to Mrs. Boston. Certainly she would have an opinion on this because she's African American. And Mrs. Boston looked like an average white middle-aged suburban mom. She was elected by the slimmest of margins and seemed to gain the favor of her constituents by criticizing the board and arguing for reforms. She had a talent for persuasion and frequently stopped the school board to adopt policies that spoke to helping the low performers rise to the top. I cannot believe that we're considering this, Mrs. Johnson said. But then, in the end, the school board decided to take the deal. I say that to say that we're at a point now where this deal is on the table, but we're not going to stand for it. And I think that we're going to be able to, and I think we need to really focus our efforts on a number of ways in which CRT can be of help to us on this, in terms of giving us the theory to push our actions forward. And there are a number of ways in which this can happen. And I think that one of the ways that we could do this is, and one of the things that I've been trying to do in my classes, is to get a videotape, and I wish I could have brought some clips here, and to take a frame-by-frame analysis of where CRT can be used to analyze every actions of administrators and teachers and run it back like a movie and say, okay, what did you do on frame 39, the 22nd minute, 13th second, with this kid at this particular point in time around this. Justify that. Why did you do that? And then talk about this whole thing. Another thing that we wanted to try to deal with in terms of looking at CRT and applying it is applying it to in our context, the Mormons context. And I'll end up with this. And it was talked to us by a superintendent who actually lived through part of this deal in terms of students walking out with KKK outfits on at halftime for Spirit Week and then wondering why they were suspended and expelled. Because the principal, the superintendent at the time said, look, I'm Mormon. I'm a deacon in my church. But before that, I spent 10 years as a civil rights lawyer in South Carolina. And he said basically that there's this way in which the context out here argues that white people who go on missions and come back have diversity because they lived in another country for 2 years. And so they can speak Spanish maybe. But it doesn't give them the real opportunities to see what it is in terms of being a white person having to deal with doing civil rights litigation in South Carolina. You got to explain to your kids that, no, over on those tracks is where black folks live, and the white people live here, and then you got colored signs and the white signs here, and having to explain that to your kids, and having to live through that turbulence during the 60s, because he was actively involved in Columbia, South Carolina, doing that kind of work. And he said, Larry, there's this way in which people move out here because they think it's Mayberry, and it's connected and religion and whiteness get conflated. And so, because of that, there's ways in which they just don't get it, even though they've been on missions and they think they get it. And there's this way in which we've got to try to fight that in terms of being able to keep this 1.3% going and to challenge all those aspects of racism that's happening in the Salt Lake schools. That's what I'm dealing with. And I just want to say that I'm thankful for being here to try to get some energy from you folks here. And I'm going to take that energy back to Salt Lake and keep the fight going. And the last thing I want to say is that I'm dedicating this last part to one of my former students, Chandra Gill. You can look up her work. She has a website called Black Academically Speaking. She's from Chicago. And Chandra was one of my best students that I worked with in Illinois. And the reason why I mention her is because I always feel that it's important for any graduate student that I'm working with or any undergraduate or high school student to do better than I did. Chandra's story is quick. She was a mentor for her sorority, brought some African-American girls to a high school basketball game in Urbana, got arrested because she stepped on the black line at 6 seconds left in the tie game. The security guard grabbed her, threw her down, arrested her. She had a seizure, got taken to the hospital, got stuffed in her tubes in her mouth because they thought she was drunk and creating disorderly conduct. She was then put in the county jail. I get a phone call and knocked on the door saying, you got to go down to the county jail because your student got arrested. So me and Jim Anderson and a bunch of people went down there and tried to work with her. To make a long story short, she went to trial, she went to jail, she got convicted on a mob action. And through that time, through that year-long trial that we were going through and trying to help Chandra out, along with my other student, Natasha Kane, I said, there was one thing you got to do, Chandra. You have to finish this degree. You are my student, you got to finish this degree. Because this is being done for a reason, to break you. And you can't be broken by this whole thing. You've got to walk out of this place, the University of Illinois, with a PhD degree. And she did. And it's one thing that as a faculty member, you think that you never are going to be put in that position, but I was. And Jim Anderson was, and we were all put in that position. We just decided to get our collective arms around her and get it done so that she could finish. And now she's got this great website that she's doing some speaking work. In fact, you should try to invite her down here next year. She is a dynamite speaker, and everybody will get a lot out of it. And I just feel it's important to support all those types of efforts in terms of leading the charge against racism and also leading the charge for justice. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hallfield, native of Tallahassee. Hopefully you can relate some of your CRTs to what's happening in Tallahassee, and I'll be very brief. If you consider this university, for example, Florida State University, there's been a 42% decline in black freshman undergraduate enrollment from 1995 to 2011. I repeat, 42% decline in black freshman undergraduate enrollment. If you look at the FSU faculty, only 3.9% of the tenured faculty at FSU is white. If you look at the football team, you would think it was a black university. So, the schools are becoming resegregated. The universities are becoming resegregated. Tallahassee is becoming resegregated. You look at the medical school at FSU, they got 41 tenured faculty at the FSU College of Medicine, none black. Perhaps you could just briefly say a word or two about this.
Those stats that you laid out are indicative of what's going on nationwide. It's been abhorrent, it's been shameful, it makes me angry when I hear those stats, but it's something that's happening across the nation at every higher education institution, and it ranges from K-12 to higher ed and beyond. All I can say right now is that we've got to use that as a way for us to not get beaten down by it. And I'll just give you an example. There was one time where I read a report like that from the Pac-12 in terms of the schools that Utah and UCLA and other schools. It was very similar figures. And it also came across the same night as one of the tragic, with the Freddie Gray thing that happened. And I was just in this bad state of affairs in terms of just feeling just down, really, really down, and angry. And I got this email from a colleague of mine in sociology. He said, Parker, what are we going to do? Are we going to just be down about this, or are we going to do something about this? And I said, what do you got in mind, brother? He said, we got to do something and get something on. So what we did was we pulled together the 4 black faculty in the College of Ed, and we decided to go for some grant money. And we got it in terms of supporting black doctoral students across all fields. Engineering, science, education, you name it. And we were able to get a small seed grant from one of the foundations because there was an interest convergence that happened at that time. Somebody on that foundation was looking at those same stats too and said, we got to do something. And it happened to converge with us, and we're going to just keep on rolling in terms of trying to do something to combat this, as well as trying to not only change the hearts and minds of the folks out there in Salt Lake, which is going to be a challenge, but also in terms of getting us together, because it's been a really good experience for me to work with my colleagues and interested allies to make this thing happen. And that's been even more important, as opposed to trying to convince folks to give us money. It's been the collective effort that we've been trying to do in terms of pulling things together. So that's how we've been able to try to deal with it. But I share with the issues that you're talking about. Yeah.
And I want to thank our speaker. We do not have time for any questions. We have the students next door. We're ready to wrap. And so we're going to wrap this up so we can go get them wrapped. And so it's very important. All your questions are important, but we cannot take this. In the interest of time, thank you very much.